talk about today is part of our land bird plan that we have recently been working on. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with the 3 billion birds report that came out a couple of years ago, finding that almost 3 billion birds have disappeared from the landscape over the past 50 years or so. And grassland birds in particular have been heavily impacted. And us being a primarily grassland geography, we thought now is a really good time to revisit and revise that land bird plan. These issues are becoming really important recently. So I do want to acknowledge everything I'm going to talk about today is in our land bird plan or related to our land bird plan. So we've had a really great writing team that we've been working with for a year and a half at this point. It's been a big undertaking, and these folks have been really helpful and really generous with their time and expertise. So, so the first step in revising our land bird plan was selecting a suite of priority species. So there are over 132 bird species that breed in our joint venture geography. So we can't possibly plan for each of those individually. We need to narrow it down and look at a smaller number of priority species. So we selected these 8 species. If we were in person, I would quiz you guys, see how good your bird ID is, but we've got here dick sissel, eastern, western meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, greater prairie chicken, northern bobwhite quail, ringneck pheasant, and then kind of the odd man out here is our red-headed woodpecker. Obviously, most of these species are heavily grassland reliant. So, and for today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on grasslands entirely. So, our next step after selecting our species is to set population objectives for those 8 species. And so we split this into 2 different strategies or goals. And the first goal being to reverse decline. So these are species that are yellow watch list species in the Partners in Flight Continental Land Bird Plan, or species that we felt were just on more shaky ground here in our joint venture geography. Their populations are getting too low, their trends are negative. So our goal for these species over a 30-year timetable is to bring those populations up by 15% and achieve or maintain positive trends for those species. Our other goal being to stabilize, and these are birds that are considered common birds in steep decline in that PIF Continental Land Bird Plan, or birds that maybe the numbers are still pretty healthy in our geography, but those trends are negative and pretty alarming. So for these species, our goal is, we expect there would be some loss, but what we want to do is turn those trends around, get those negative trends to at least be flat, hopefully even positive trends. So that is how we set our population objectives for those 8 species. So how do we achieve those population objectives? How do we bring those numbers up or flatten those negative trends? Well, we need to identify the main threats. So using an expert elicitation process, we identified 2 main threats that we want to look at in our geography. And the first of those being conversion of land, primarily to agricultural production. So just we're losing grasslands, mainly to being converted to cropland. And so you can see that in this map. The orange speckles, we see, lots of orange speckles all over, some blue where areas are being taken out of agricultural production, but way more orange and too much of it spread throughout the landscape where we're losing those grasslands. So based on our population objectives, we have an idea of how much grassland we're going to need to have on the landscape in 30 years. We estimate that's about 19.7 million acres of grassland that we need to have in 30 years if we want to achieve those population objectives. But using the current, recent conversion rates that we've been seeing, we estimate that there will only be 18.2 million grassland acres on the landscape in 30 years if we do nothing. So we need to figure out a way to make up that 1.5 million acre deficit. So moving on to our next threat, something I'm sure we've already heard a lot about today and we'll continue, woody encroachment. And so again, the orange here being those areas where canopy cover has increased by more than 3%. And we see quite a lot of that. I mean, we do see some blue where canopy cover has been removed or addressed, but we see a lot more orange, especially that woody encroachment in the eastern sandhills and central Luss Hills, Luss Canyons areas. This is our number 2 threat that we want to address. And so our estimates indicate that woody encroachment is impacting over 1 million grassland acres a year newly new encroachment is happening there. And that's about 6% of all grassland acres. And so, this is where woody encroachment needs to be specifically removed or addressed, or the problem is just going to snowball. And so now that we know how much habitat we need, how much work needs to be done to achieve those population objectives, we can figure out how much is that going to cost. And so to get those, 1.5 million acres that we expect to lose to conversion, we estimate this would cost $19 million per year over the next 30 years. And that cost to address woody encroachment could be up to $21 million a year. So we're looking at needing about $40 million a year for the next 30 years if we're going to meet those population objectives and recover those species. So that's all very grim and depressing. So now I want to get to the good news and the main focus of this presentation, which is prioritizing grassland areas for conservation, so we can really increase our impact, so we can impact positively more species and or more individuals, more breeding individuals in our geography. So I'm going to go through two examples here, just kind of very simple step-by-step process. So the first step in our prioritization process here is to identify the grassland bird conservation areas. What areas are important for grassland birds, for the species that you're interested in? And so we use this by building a set of species distribution models. And I have to give credit where credit's due. You'll see in the abstracts that Greg Brinkman is the first author on this presentation, and Greg and Andy Bishop and Roger Grossi, this is kind of their brainchild, and I'm just here to present on it today. So they've put a lot of effort into making these models and putting this all together. So here we see an example for one species, our grasshopper sparrow, the species distribution model on the left being built with breeding bird survey data for the grasshopper sparrow. And on the right, we've decided we want to look at areas, the smallest area that holds 50% of breeding grasshopper sparrows in Nebraska. And so that's what the red is. So the red is having those highest densities of breeding grasshopper sparrows. So these are the areas that we want to focus on if we want to help grasshopper sparrows. So for this example, though, we want to look at more than one species, not just grasshopper sparrow, but a suite of species here. So we've got dick sissel, eastern western meadowlark, grasshopper sparrow, greater prairie chicken, and then you'll see sharp-tailed grouse was not one of our priority species, but in this example, we're adding this in just to show that you can select your own adventure here. You pick the species that you want to work on, what the species that your organization prioritizes. And so for this example, we're looking at this set of 6 species, and for each of these, we've built that species distribution model and identified that upper 50% area. And so the map here shows where those upper 50% areas overlap for these 6 species. You can see you get up to 5 core geographies, 5 core geographies for up to 5 species in some areas of Nebraska here. And so if we wanted to focus on these 6 species, we might say, well, looks like we ought to maybe work in these areas of the sandhills. So but you may see that, if we're focusing on these species, you would only want to work in the sandhills and almost nowhere else. But what if your agency doesn't work there? What if you don't work there? What if you have funding to work somewhere else? So you can in this process, we can pick our own geography, our own scale that we want to work on. So over on the right here, you'll see we have, again, created a core map for each of those 6 species. But in this case, we have looked at each GFA individually. So we're comparing sandhills to sandhills and not sandhills to Rainwater Basin. So, you pick what geography you want to work in, and we could do this with BULs or in our D boundaries. We can pretty much pick any geography that you want to look at here. So I should mention, for this example, we're going to look at Central Les Hills. For both examples, we're going to focus on Central Les Hills. So our next step, which conservation practice or conservation strategy are we using? Which do we want to apply? And in this example, we're going to do CRP. And so our eligibility here, the criteria is at least 40 acres of cropland and at least 25% highly erodible soils in the tract. So here's our highly erodible soil map for the Central Les Hills, and we have another map that delineates all the tracts that have at least 40 acres of cropland, and we overlap those. And we take all of our ingredients here and we can make a prioritization map. So we've got our selected geography here, the Central Les Hills, our selected suite of priority species. We could see the darker purple blue areas on the map are where 4 or 5 species overlap. So in this example, that's what we're prioritizing, areas where 4 or 5 species overlap. Our eligible tracts that have the minimum number of cropland acres and minimum amount of highly erodible soils are outlined in blue or orange here. And so we distinguish between them by the orange tracts are overlapping with those cores for at least four or five of our priority species that we're looking at in this example. The blue ones do not overlap with 4 or 5 species. It's 3 or less. So in this example, you know, if we're choosing where to put those CRP acres, we would want to put them in those orange tracts. So does this really make that big of a difference? Well, we can find out. We can check that out. So currently, there are about 7,500 CRP grassland acres in the Central Les Hills. That's the blue areas over here on this map. And so those actual CRP acres, we estimate that they support for greater prairie chickens about 985 individuals. But if we had taken those acres, the same amount of acres, and put them instead only on priority tracts, you know, random selection of priority tracts, we could be impacting over 1,100 greater prairie chickens. And so that's the purple over here. This is our random selection of priority tracts. Another way to look at this with grasshopper sparrow, the actual CRP acres we estimate have a density of 1 individual per 6.2 acres. But those same acres put onto prioritized tracts could support 1 individual per 4.4 acres. So overall, you're just getting more bang for your buck by using those priority acres. So if we put our money into those prioritized properties, we can support the same number of individuals with 29% fewer acres. Okay, our second example. Again, we're going to decide what are our priority birds here that we want to look at. In this example, we'll just do 1 species, greater prairie chicken. So again, here is the species distribution model that we built for the whole state for greater prairie chicken. But again, we're going to zoom in this example and look at the Central Les Hills. So we can run that same model, but only looking at Central Les Hills. And so our high density areas here being in the dark red areas. Our conservation practice in this example is going to be EQIP funded tree removal and prescribed fire. And so our eligibility for that is mean canopy cover of at least 1% in these recent years, 2017 to 2019. And so this is going to be grasslands that are having that minimum mean canopy cover of 1%. So again, we overlap all of our variables here that we've got. We're looking at the Central Les Hills. We're looking only at greater grasslands that support a high density of greater prairie chickens, being that green area. And so all of the blue here is all of those prioritized tracts that have that meet that minimum 1% criteria and also overlap with those greater prairie chicken grassland areas. So again, we can estimate what happens if we work on those prioritized tracts only. And so we have 2 different practices here. So in the top map shows the actual areas that were treated with tree removal and prescribed fire in that 2017 to 2019 period. And the bottom one is a random selection, same number of acres of prioritized only tracts. So in actuality, there were about 21,000 acres treated with tree removal and 11,000 treated with prescribed fire. Those actual tree removal acres, we estimate impacted 107 prairie chickens. But we estimate that if that same tree removal had been applied to prioritized tracts, we could have impacted 172 prairie chickens. Again, with the prescribed fire, the actual areas treated, we estimate impacted 54 individuals. But we estimate that if that fire had been applied only to prioritized tracts, we could have impacted 95 individuals. So if we are working on prioritized acres, we could potentially impact 60 to 75% more individual prairie chickens in this example. So I just wanted to go through those two, fairly simple examples today. There's obviously going to be a lot more information about this in the plan and coming out in recent months. So if you're very interested in this, I'd encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. Only a few times a year, so you won't get a lot of spam in your inbox there. But if you go to our website, this is what it looks like. And in the upper right corner there, you'll see a button for e-news sign up, very simple, and you'll get updates about this project and other projects that we've been working on. So if everybody's not in a big hurry to get to lunch, I think I can take a few questions.